I'm your host and editor, Diana Longry. Thank you for tuning in. The Citizens Reporter is brought to you weekly from the Valley Access Studios in Stillwater. Now, to help me this week with this week's news is one of our regular citizen reporters, Mr. Mark Bradley. Thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here.
Thank you for having me. And I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different today because I actually went to one of the hearings they had, which happens to be the Ramsey County Truth in Taxation hearing that was happening at the Maplewood Library, and they were discussing policy at this point.
And
today.
also, some of the different budget issues. I understand from other folks who were there that half the room was there concerned about the Ramsey County budget and the property tax levy. The other half of the room were concerned about the closure of the Ponds Golf Course, which we have covered extensively here on these programs.
And that's also a very important issue because of the fact that it does affect our taxation. In fact, I was one of the people that brought up the issue that if we're going to be closing the ponds and developing it for something else, it should be prioritized to something that's very tax positive for the county and the city.
Right, and looking at the property tax base that it would bring,
right.
Whatever that development might be.
But it was one of those things I think they kind of were dumbfounded on because they thought, well, as long as we say we are willing to close it because it's not worth it, everybody's going to accept our word. Right. And then, of course, I've got the articles that are in the newspaper that also I like to touch on. And there's so many of them that if we just touch them lightly, I'd love to touch them harder, but we've got so little time and so many articles to talk over. So the truth of the matter is that, of course, at the same time, in the Pioneer Press, they are talking about the issue of what is St. Paul going to do for the 2020 plans. And they've got all these great plans, but they're spending money with no return on value. And this is what's bothering me, is you've got all these politicians sitting up there talking about how they can raise your taxes, and it's going to make it harder for you to do anything, and they're not going to give you value for it.
Now, this particular article that Mr. Bradley is looking at is in the St. Paul Pioneer Press, the local section of November 17th, entitled East Metro, Communities Present Projects to Lawmakers. Boy, that makes it sound very lofty.
Right.
And it says the 2020 bonding requests include funding for the St. Paul Bridge and downtown development. And it says members of the Minnesota House Capital Investment Committee, they made a stop at the Raspberry Island in St. Paul to view the site of a proposed river edge development along the downtown Mississippi River Bluff. And it goes on to say in this article that this wish list ranges from $40 million to build a new urban park in downtown St. Paul, to $40,000 to fix a water pressure problem in a tiny city of Mendota, which has a population of 220. It also goes on to say that with regard to St. Paul, top priorities, that during a lunch at the Union Depot on Wednesday, the St. Paul Mayor Melvin Carter told committee members the bridge, which was partially closed in 2014 because of structural deficiencies, is back at the top of the city's bonding priority list for the 6th year. He said reconstructing the bridge is essential to the city's future growth. Well, certainly I think bridges do help to connect the city of St. Paul with the other side of the river. So thank you, Mr. Bradley,
right.
for bringing that to our attention.
But I would like to also make the point that $40 million for a park makes a good question of what is the logic in that. And to be honest, what they used to talk about was it's to construct the river walk, which was a walk that we talked about last year and a couple of years ago, that's just supposed to have people out in the weather trying to walk on the edge of the city of St. Paul all the way up and down what would be called Kellogg, and at the same time make a platform for hopeful office hotel complex that was supposed to be built last year, but the contractor pulled out because he felt that it wasn't feasible at the time.
Right.
Especially for the requests that were there. And
Right.
we've talked about this many times.
That's right, exactly.
So then from there, we have, of course, where, I'm looking at logic in these things, and I'm questioning, why would you want to build a water park where there is a water park already at the Mall of America, especially with the idea that you're going to have to use increased taxes, sales taxes, to cover it, which means that the reason the Mall of America was constructed is kind of a central core shopping center, which also has an entertainment facility on it.
Right, and in this particular article, this is in the Star Tribune of November 14th, and we've covered part of this story in the past with the proposal that a water park would go into the Mall of America. And in order to make the project seem feasible, the City Council of Bloomington, even though they did not want to commit the City of Bloomington to any financial guarantees with regard to this project and the funding for this project, the City Council of Bloomington did have to agree that they would vote on the use of sales tax in the City of Bloomington to help pay the debt in the event that the revenue that's generated from the water park once it's open doesn't cover the expenses that were expended and the mortgage and the money borrowed in order to build the water park. So this is a follow-up on our story that we had previously. And it does say here then that the issue of the sales tax did come before the Bloomington City Council, and it says the City Council voted unanimously on Tuesday to authorize imposing these sales taxes. Now this is 11 years after the legislature granted them that power. So you see, the City of Bloomington has always had the power that they could have a city sales tax, because obviously here in Minnesota we have a state sales tax,
right,
which is applied on any type of purchase that you may be purchasing. There are some exceptions, such as clothing and food and aspirins, for instance. But for a city to be able to charge sales tax, they actually have to go to the legislature with a purpose in mind, and then they have to get the approval of the legislature. So, for instance, cities such as Bloomington has gotten that in the past, but apparently they hadn't used it even though they were granted it. But the cities of Minneapolis have this power. Rochester has this power. I believe Duluth has this power. And I think that from what I've heard at some of the recent city council meetings, the city of Maplewood is anticipating that they want to go to the state legislature and ask that they too in Maplewood will be able to charge a city sales tax.
And
so imagine that, huh?
And I've gone across the United States traveling, and one of the issues I've always had when I do travel is I find out what the prices are at the hotels, including the hotel tax, because of you can be in the same city, or I should say the same region, and you go into different cities and they have a different hotel tax on it. So I've found that if you book in like South Chicago, it's a different price than going into North Chicago. And that's dependent upon what the cities are going to burden it with. I guess my point is that when you're talking about this, if it's the Mall of America or Maplewood, if you can go to the next shopping center like Burnsville or let's say Ridgedale, why would you be buying in the Mall of America if you're going to pay 15 to 30% more on the purchase? even as 5 or 10. I found that when we hit that tax that was for the Dome Stadium, it became an issue to where I bought my food because there were certain areas that didn't have to apply that tax for the
When you go out to
U.S. Bank.
Right, when you
facility.
go out to a restaurant, for
Right.
instance. I mean, that's a great example. And the point that you make is certainly a good point to remind policymakers of, especially in Maplewood, where they are concerned about the life cycle of the Maplewood Mall. Certainly, if suddenly now the city of Maplewood is having a sales tax, people who might be going to the Maplewood Mall, they may just say, well, I will just drive a short distance to go to the Rosedale Mall and do my shopping there. That there's more shops, it's more vibrant, it's not that far away, it's just off of 36. So that's a good question. Does it actually drive consumers from your community if you have a sales tax? And if you don't have enough incentive for them to come to your location as a destination location, that basically gives them that feeling that it's worth paying the extra, they're going to say, why do I want to pay the extra just to go to mediocre?
And the point is that when we're looking at all this stuff, a lot of times when you're hearing people wring their make complaints and wring their hands, you find out that the truth of the matter is that it doesn't really have anything to do with the shopping centers itself. It happens to do with the precepts that are to it, because the reality is that the same folly and practice should be for all the other shopping centers within the area. And if they're doing great, and especially you gave a great example in Rosedale. Rosedale is, because it's in between Minneapolis and St. Paul, the advantage is that it draws a lot of people, but that also makes it very congested, makes it hard to get in and out of. And if you're looking at a shopping center, Maplewood Mall makes more sense because it's easy to get into, it's easy there. Even though they're crying about all these different places going, it's because of the internet, not because of anything else. But the restaurant actually have been growing in Maplewood, so the actual reality is that Maplewood's actually still a good center, and it's trying to remarket itself. I remember when there was one major store called Sears that's there. Sears still owns the building. They haven't decided what they want to do with it. So to be precise, there is no real reason to be wringing hands except for the little retailers who could no longer compete against the internet.
And there is a new trend that is occurring around the nation as well. It's this creation of food malls.
Right.
Where you brought up the idea about that the restaurants and the growth of restaurants in Maplewood seems to be certainly not on a downturn. It may even be growing somewhat. And in some areas, what they are finding that there's a great interest in is having sort of like you had the old food courts at the malls in the past, but an expanded version of that, and a little bit more of a sit-down, nice environment, and not just a fast food environment, where people go there to the food mall so that they can actually try food from many different nationalities, different types of food, different varieties. And it's really taking off in many communities. And I did notice that at the Maplewood Mall that they do have a good variety of food vendors and
Right.
restaurants in the mall. So as you said, there's trying to reestablish their presence, that
Right.
they're trying to find and do some new things. They have some short-term rental options for people who have, like, say, just a week need for a space because they have maybe a display of artwork or something that they want to present for a week, and so they can rent a space there at the Maplewood Mall, just on a short-term basis.
And the
not-
city can use part of that open space as well, like they've done in
Right.
other malls we talked about before.
That's right, exactly. So thank you, Mr. Bradley, for bringing that up. What's next?
Well, then, of course, we have an article that's in the Star Tribune. Excel and I'm trying to remember what's called in Minneapolis. They're looking at increasing the rates on the cost of supplying us with energy right now. And I find it ironic because with all these gardens that have been created, the solar gardens, the wind gardens, we don't have to be buying this energy from outside sources as much. And the landlines that deliver it to the Twin Cities don't have to be used as much. So if we're also getting excess energy that's supposed to be being paid at a, how should I, preferential rate to Excel, they should actually be looking at, but I think what they're really, in honesty, looking at is the decommissioning costs. And this is what I would like the honest answer on, because I remember when there was
And that's the decommissioning costs associated with the nuclear power plants in Minnesota, correct?
and also the coal-fired plants, because they're also changing those, some to gas and some they're just taking offline. So when they have the buildings there, they have to tear them down when it's nuclear. They have to at least clear the land for the coal-fired plants if they're not going to use them anymore. So the reality is that anything like that, you have to take the cost of destroying it. And with nuclear, you have to be very particular. You have to store any interior and exterior because of the nuclear radiation that's still on it in a special location. This is why I said nuclear was never penny cheap. It was a fraud that was perpetrated on us that said we can pass it on to next generations.
Now, in this particular article from the Star Tribune of November 17th, it indicates that this utility rate request for increased rates will actually push Minnesota's rates past the national average. And earlier this month, Minnesota's two largest electricity utilities, Xcel Energy and Minnesota Power, asked state regulators for a significant rate hike. That would be 15% for Xcel over the next 3 years. And says anytime prices go up, we are concerned, says the commissioner of Minnesota Department of Commerce. Well, duh, I guess so. And it goes on to say that that the cost increases are in large part because investments by Minnesota utilities turn to A15 that the investment of the utilities with the blessing of state regulators are surging at a rate not seen since 1970 and the early 1980s. So what they're inferring is that because they have all this investment that they're doing into their infrastructure or their facilities, of course, that means that they didn't plan ahead to have that already in the kitty in the bank, so they have to raise it in order to pay for their upcoming investments. Well, there you go. Now, the other point that I don't think that this article brings out is that many people are actually using less electricity now than they have in the past, because we have all these different types of energy saver switches and energy saving light bulbs that you can use now that use a fraction of the electricity that once was used by a comparable light bulb, you know, even 10 years back. Even our TVs today, because of the way that they're constructed, is different. The energy requirements are different for them than it is for the old TVs,
And
where
don't
people.
forget our appliances.
That's right, and appliances as well. So you see, if people are using less electricity, then that means that they're actually collecting for people's using less electricity. So the revenues go down, and because they still have all these costs that they want to cover, plus they got to make a profit too, right?
Right.
They have to increase then the cost of that electricity. So even though this article, I think, focuses on investments, I think in part it might be due to the fact that there's been a decreased demand over time.
And
Mr.
if there is
Bradley.
that decreased demand, you'd think that that would actually make it where they can do an evaluation and determine which units to keep functioning and which units decommission, because if they really don't need to be generated as much, so their costs should be going down because they don't have as many people working for them or as much material, especially when you're talking about the coal-fired plants that they've just taken offline. I'd think that that'd be a lot more expensive than pumping even gas, because you're shipping that off of a pipeline.
Yep, exactly. Okay, and then I know you had one other last article that you wanted to bring up, which of course is a great lead-in then to our next topic, where we're going to be focusing on Ramsey County. But this is a particular case coming out of the state tax court of all places. And from time to time, we have had articles on here about what's going on with the Enbridge and their pipeline, and how it's being constructed, or where it's going, or who's objecting to it going where it's going. Well, this particular article has to do with the value of the land on which those pipelines cross. What is the value of that land? So you see, just like any other property, there's a property valuation, and based upon that property valuation, then the property tax value and the property taxes collected are then the result of whatever value is assigned. And of course, if you're a homeowner out there, you know exactly how that works. The county says, haha, this is how much your property is worth, haha. This is how much we're going to now charge you for property taxes. Well, Enbridge is no different. And it has turned out that the Minnesota tax court has raised the valuation of Enbridge's oil pipeline corridor. Now, this, of course, it says, is a setback for the Canadian Oil Company, because they were counting on having a lower property value, so they'd have to pay less taxes. But that valuation has gone up. And it says that Enbridge and the Minnesota Department of Revenue have been battling for years over valuing the company's pipelines, which carry oil from Alberta across 13 northern Minnesota counties to Superior, Wisconsin. And it says that up until last week, Enbridge had mostly prevailed in its tax appeals. Now, this is a funny way to talk about a legal proceeding. Prodded by the Minnesota Supreme Court. I didn't realize that the Minnesota Supreme Court prodded anybody. I think they either rule or they don't rule. But it's interesting that in this case, they are described as prodding. That they prodded the tax court on November 5th to revise its May 2018 valuation order, which dealt with the assessments for 2012, 2013, and 2014. So that the tax court has now set the 2014 value of the Enbridge pipeline system at $4.73 billion, which is still $879 million, or 16% below what the Department of Revenue had as their valuation. Now, with property tax valuations, it is not uncommon that the tax court, the Minnesota tax court, will look at a number of years, because generally an individual or a company that is doing an appeal of their property taxes, and that they're actually going to court and to tax court on that, they're not only appealing just 1 year, but they also then appeal the next couple of subsequent years, because those subsequent years are based on the year that's being initially appealed. So in Maplewood, for instance, 3M very routinely appeals their property tax evaluation, and they've been successful in those appeals. And when I was mayor, that was one of the periods of time when 3M had gotten a favorable ruling from the Minnesota tax court that the valuation of 3M's property was less. So that meant that for 3 years that were being determined, 3M didn't have to pay as much property taxes. And the way that this works is that if you're in appeal, you still have to pay the property taxes that have been charged. But if you win your appeal, guess what? Now the municipality, the county, and all the other taxing authorities, including the school district, they have to find that money in their coffers somewhere, and they have to give it back to the winning party. And that's why oftentimes municipalities, if they're not keeping track of how many property tax appeals that they have in their city, can come up shorthanded, because at the end of one of these court cycles, it could turn out that the city's got to come up with money to refund a certain amount of property tax that they've already collected, and by the way, already spent, and now they have to give that money back. Well, now, Mr. Bradley, at the top of the program this evening, you had indicated that you had gone to the Ramsey County Truth in Taxation hearing. That was on November 25th, 2019 at the Maplewood Public Library up by the Maplewood Mall. And I do believe that the Ramsey County is holding another one or two of these similar type meetings in other locations. And by the time that this program is up and available for viewing, or if you're watching it either on YouTube or on public access channels, well, those meetings probably will have gone by, but at least you'll get the flavor of what was going on at this first Truth in Taxation hearing. Now, Ramsey County knew that there were a number of issues in this season's budgeting cycle that had residents of Ramsey County, maybe particularly Maplewood and St. Paul, up in arms, and that they should have expected that they would be beyond capacity at their Truth in Taxation hearing. So we've got some film footage to give you an idea of how well attended this hearing was. Let's take a look. That is the entryway into the meeting room at the Maplewood Public Library. Those people, they're not able to even get into the room. They're not able to sit down. They're not able to be within earshot of what's really going on. Now, certainly they did have some monitors set up so that people could try to listen to it remotely outside of the room, but that's never quite the same as actually being in the room where you can hear the people at the microphone. Mr. Bradley, now you were there. Were you shocked by how many people were there?
I was shocked by how many people were there, but what also surprised me was how courteous and very kind the people were there, because they were trying to offer seats to people. Everybody's kind of taking care of everybody else there, it looked like. And it kind of surprised me that way as well. But yeah, it was so packed, it was unbelievable. I stood for a while, and then somebody, because I've got MS, offered me a seat, so I took it. And then I moved forward to make my presentation later on. But like I said, it was just unbelievable, the amount of people, each of them making a point on where they're looking at. And it's funny to listen to the commissioners answering the questions.
Now we have the next clip where we have some of the comments of people who were there. This hearing went on for nearly 2 hours, I believe, maybe 3 hours, because the library closes at 9 o'clock, and they were hard pressed to be able to get everybody out of the library on time. And in fact, were unable to get everybody out of the library on time. I do think that this hearing started at 6 o'clock, And I think there were remarks in the beginning before they opened up the public hearing. But let's listen to our next clip as we hear one gentleman speak with his comments.
Jerome Gunther.
Gittler.
Yep, come on up, Jerome. I'm doing my best on those names, and you can raise the mic there.
I'm Jerome Gittler. I've been a 31-year resident of St. Paul, born and raised. I've been coming to these things for probably 20 years, but we're really talking to the wrong people. This is a state law that dictates how they collect your taxes. There is no relationship between the increase in valuation and your ability to pay more of their budget. There has to be a limit on what they can raise in your taxes. They have raised our commercial properties, our apartment buildings, out of reach of most private citizens. We lose all our jobs in St. Paul. If you want to get your car fixed, you have to drive 30 miles out of town because the properties have gotten so expensive. And they control the valuation. They hyperinflate the valuation to increase your property taxes so they can meet their budgets. But there's no limit on what they can charge. My estimate is going to be 30% more this year. We cannot. We say this every year, but in the last 30 years, it's averaged 7% increase, where wages barely make 1% increase. There is no limit to what they can charge. There has to be a limit. It has to be set by the state, and we have to do something with the state to get this to change. Otherwise, you're going to be here every year saying the same thing.
Now that gentleman brought up a number of issues, and keep in mind, the people there to speak are only allowed 2 minutes
Right.
to get their thoughts out. He had a number of good points. One, that maybe the state legislature needs to set a cap or a limit on what can be increased each and every year. This gentleman indicated that his increases that he's experiencing are going to be 30%. And that is not uncommon, particularly if you have one of the most affordable properties. And in the past few programs over the last month and a half, we've actually been talking about this and showing you the film footage from the Ramsey County board meetings where they describe what they call a tax shift, where they have evaluated the valuations of the properties, the most reasonably priced properties in the areas of St. Paul, Maplewood, and a number of other smaller communities that we've talked about in the past, where they have the valuations have been jacked up an amount that then produces, based upon the equations, the highest increases in property tax. And this gentleman makes a good point where he says you are basically taxing the small guy business out of town. That small guy who's doing the car repairs or whatever, the business that he's operating, he's not making enough money to pay the property taxes. So if somebody needs to go and get their car repaired at a reasonable rate, they have to go further away in order to find somebody to provide those services at an affordable cost because they don't have the same overhead costs.
And when you're taking a look at these costs as they are, you have to also take a look at the budgets that are being brought out by Maplewood and the city of St. Paul and our county commissioner and our state planners. Because the fact is that these grandiose plans, basically somebody has to pay for them in the end. So you as the taxpayer are the ones who are going to pick them up. And as he was presenting the business side of it. So it isn't that the other guys are getting a break on this, and this is what they kind of play us against. We as the owners of houses and residences say, hey, our taxes are going so high that can't you find somebody else? And of course they say, well, take a look at those guys that own the office buildings and the apartment complexes. They're the ones who are getting the break on. he's one of those that owns those. So he's saying, no, we're not getting a break on. So what the truth of the matter is that as they add more people to their city, as they add grandiose plans to the city, all the things we've discussed on our shows over the years, these are the issues that really have to be brought up. And if they're not being really responsible, then they are the real reason that we should be getting them out of there.
And of course, don't forget that the Ramsey County Commissioners all felt that they were doing a great job, and they all gave themselves a big fat pay raise. So we can't forget that. Now, they are also responsible in elevating the budget of the county because they're giving themselves these pay raises. And as we've done an analysis in the past, while they say that they're getting the same percentage that is the same as all the county employees, the same percent, they're not treating themselves any differently, the scale is different in that if you have the majority of the employees in Ramsey County who are making, say, somewhere between $50,000 and $60,000 annually, their 6% or their 3% is very much different than if you're a county commissioner and you're already making nearly $100,000 a year. Those Ramsey County commissioners should have taken a smaller percentage in increase if they want to indeed be acting in equity. Well, now let's take a look at the next comment from another resident of Ramsey County.
Chris Holberg, Mark Bradley. Come on up. Yep. Name and city, please.
My name is Chris Holbrook. I live in St. Paul. I just walked in here. I've been sitting in line behind 40 other people to talk to an assessor, so I apologize if I repeat anything. Everything that guy just said is right. The two duplexes I own and rent out as naturally occurable affording housing are going up 33% and 46%. The criminal part about that is for my low-income renters. I have to raise their rents $30 and $40 a month just to cover these property tax increases. If you're worried about equity and inequity, you really need to look in the mirror instead of charging regressively to the poorest neighborhoods in the county and in the city. I think it's just a terrible situation. Like he said, there needs to be a maximum, there needs to be assistance instead of taking money from poor people and giving it to rich people to develop other property.
Vicki Reinhardt, when she spoke before the Maplewood City Council, specifically stated that their budget this year is looking with the lens of equity when they are making their decisions. And yet you hear this gentleman who is talking about the impact that these types of double-digit increases have to his tenants. Because he, as the landlord, he can't absorb 30, 46% increase in his property taxes. He has to pass it on to his renters. And in order to cover that property tax increase, now these renters, who by the way, probably would like to have a job that is a good paying, sustainable job at the same rate as Vicki Reinhardt, but they probably don't have a job like Vicki Reinhardt. And so they are less likely and less able to absorb those kinds of increases to the rental than Vicki Reinhardt is able to also be able to absorb those increases if she were in their shoes. So Vicki Reinhardt and her lens of equity in budgets.
This is the first budget cycle with our new structure of being organized into service delivery teams. And the idea there is to make sure that everyone in the county, that we understand that the goal for the county is prosperity, opportunity, well-being, and accountability through the lens of equity for every resident in Ramsey County. And so that is what we have done the service team is in basically those 4 areas and trying to make sure that we are making informed decisions. And they are based on measurements and outcomes that are included in the
That was
budget.
the clip that we've showed previously, and I think it brings it home that there is, as Mr. Bradley indicated, a certain amount of hypocrisy going on. That they want to talk about equity, that they're looking at their budgeting and their decisions using the lens of equity, but in reality, it's just not true. Now, Mr. Bradley, you got up, you had something to say. You know what? I think you're up next, so let's take a look.
Name and city, please.
Mark Bradley, 2164 Woodland Avenue in Maplewood, Minnesota. I'm here to make a statement on the fact that, first of all, there's a lot of insincerity here. We're talking about low-income housing in an area that's very distressed as it is right now, when we should be talking about where it's going in the whole state. We should talk about what we really need here is more business to grow here, which means that we need, if we're going to get rid of the ponds, we've got to take a look at what the value of what we already built is. And it's still making money at this point, not a lot, but a little bit. The question is, what did you invest in? And that's all wiped out at this point. Plus, also at the same time, we're trying to say, what are we going to do for the future? We got a range that's been sitting across the street from that facility for years that was supposed to be abandoned and never was. And they now say, oh yeah, but we could have had an indoor range. Yes, I know that. But the problem was we could have had that years ago. Everybody knew that. The problem was that when it happens to be that we can find an area where we can dump, we'll dump. We happen to have some businesses that are actually growing. In fact, we have right now, 61 is actually what you'd call Car Street. Go up there into White Bear Lake, come all the way down to St. Paul. There's cars up and down there that are being sold. What we're looking at there is something that's got a tax base to it. But we're going to even try to take that out. Maplewood in hand with Ramsey County says, oh geez, that's not important. Let's talk about building, along with the Metro, this rapid transit, poo-poo that anybody needs a car in Maplewood at all. No, we're talking about investment here. If we look at it from that standpoint, get rid of the gun range, expand, if the golf course is not making what you realistically think it should, let's expand it. We've got land across the way. We can also make it into an actual entertainment area with football fields, because there's a lot of land over there for the kids.
Thank you, Mark.
That we have in the north, but not in the south.
Well, you must have came to the end of your 2 minutes. Thank you, Mark.
We don't care what's it's good for the public or this is a good idea. Hey, you're done. Let's get out.
Well, and you know, again, in 2 minutes, trying to get out all the concepts of what you want to communicate to the county commissioners is very difficult, because it isn't just a one single issue conversation. Now, I want to go to clip number 31, and I want to bring, this is out of sequence, but this is Vicki Reinhardt when she was before the Maplewood City Council about 3 weeks before this public truth and taxation hearing. And this is where she is giving an update to the Maplewood City Council about Ramsey County's big initiative for, trying to establish and assist in economic development. Since you brought this up to them, this is, in essence, their response to what they're doing. Let's take a look.
One of the things that we are looking at is, and I want to point out, is the partnering in economic development. Ramsey County is the only fully developed county in the state, which means increasing our tax base becomes more difficult. And the fact is, we have room to develop, but it's really redevelopment, and that's the difference here. And that leads me to what I really want to make sure you understand, and don't forget that this tool is available to you, and that is the Environmental Response Fund. We set it up so that if there is a project, but there is pollution in the land or on the property, that we can provide funding that, but for the cleanup costs, it wouldn't be developed. And so the Environmental Response Fund is something that if somebody is coming to you and saying, we'd like to redevelop this, or we'd like to develop something here, but there's such a cost in the cleanup that it wouldn't make it viable for them. So please remember that that is out there. We have tried very hard to make sure that we divvy that fund up between the suburbs and the city of St. Paul. Primarily because the city of St. Paul could take it all, so we're very careful about trying to make sure we get it into the suburbs as well.
Victoria Reinhardt, at the council meeting when she's there at Maplewood, she doesn't say how large this fund is, but we certainly know, and we've covered this on these news programs in the past, that the Hillcrest Golf Course, which is in St. Paul, which is no longer an operational golf course, that had been a golf course since the early 1900s, that property was sold to the pipe fitters, and then the pipe fitters sold it to the city of St. Paul and their port authority. And then after all of that, and as part of that purchase, they determined that it was contaminated with a high level of contaminants that need to have remediation. So guess what, Mr. Mark Bradley? I think St. Paul will indeed get a large chunk of that money. But I'm wondering, with the Ponds Golf Course that the Ramsey County owns, are they going to have similar contamination issues at their golf course? Now, certainly it hasn't been in operation as long as the Hillcrest Golf Course, but it brings up that question, what are the costs of that property depending upon what its contamination could or could not be? The other property you were talking about was the gun range. What kind of contamination might be possible there at the gun range, which the Ramsey County owns the property? It's located in Maplewood, but it has been leased for many, many years, I think since maybe the 50s or 60s, by the St. Paul Police Department. Is there lead contamination there? I don't know. But you see, Ramsey County is mostly it sounds like from what Vicki Reinhardt's saying, that their big economic development concern is contamination, rather than figuring out how to also in a parallel track, how to encourage business development through other ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be financial, but it can be the way that a community is welcoming to business. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're handing money out to them.
And when you're taking a look at that, it's just like what's happened with the 3M site, where you find a major owner who wants to come in and build a structure on the 3M site. They've got that new Vomella plant there. So the reality is that if you put something on and cap it, you don't have to worry about the pollution if you're not going to have people getting contaminated.
You bring up a good point in that if you know in advance what type of environmental issues there might be at a site or contamination, maybe you need to guide then that property for uses that are less impacted by that contamination. And you brought up a good example. Let's not build a school on a dump site. Doesn't that make sense?
Right.
But if you have a commercial use and you can properly cap the site, then you can put the commercial use there, and it's not the same impact as if you say, well, we want to put a bunch of high-density residential housing in that area. See, so
Exactly.
that is something that I think needs a bigger discussion. We have one more comment from the Truth and Taxation hearing. This doesn't mean, of course, that we're done covering the Truth and Taxation hearing, because we have at least an hour's worth of film footage. And by the way, this film footage from this meeting is exclusive here with Put Your Hands Together Productions.
And our camera people had to do a lot of effort that night because we were at 3 different meetings at the same time.
Yes. Well, let's take a look at our next clip, which is number 43.
Up and get in line. Next speaker, name and city, please.
Jeff DiGregorio, St. Paul. I've listened to all of you talk about a golf course. I work for Health and Wellness Division, and we have other issues besides a golf course in our county. If you enjoy golfing as much as I do, go to a different golf course. All right? Sorry. Wait a minute. I work for Ramsey County.
Of course.
So, I've heard all of you talk about golf courses. I've heard all of you talk about golf courses. We have more to deal with than a golf course. All right? Just my thoughts. Enjoy your day. All right?
Closing a golf course doesn't help with
But
how you're talking.
let's keep it. Jeff, you have the floor.
Excuse me?
No.
Closing a golf course, what?
Jeff, you're speaking to the county board. This is the public hearing right
Sorry,
here.
I apologize.
Thank you.
All right.
Smart ass.
Enjoy. All right? We don't need a golf course. We need help in our system. All right?
Well, there you go. Now we've got the point of view of a county employee. Well, you know, and there is some value in what he has to say, in that certainly, yes, we need to look at his department as well to make sure that it is funded properly so they can provide the services that they need to the people who are getting their services from health and the Department of Health and Welfare. But the other folks who are concerned about the golf course, some of them it's because they use that golf course, they like that golf course. Quite a few of them who are concerned about the closure of the golf course are concerned about what Ramsey County is going to do with that property when the golf course is closed. And that is one of the underlying issues that Ramsey County commissioners really don't want to address, even though that's already been reported in the newspaper that basically they want to put voucher housing as one of the options right up at the top of the list for this property.
And as I mentioned when I was speaking, that we are actually a distressed area. There is a lot of low-income housing already here, and it really, we need to get more tax base, and that's not going to do it. So why even make a proposal like that? It just drives me crazy.
That's right, exactly. Well, thank you, Mr. Bradley, for being here today for our program.
Thank you for having me.
And viewers, thank you for tuning in to the Citizens Reporter. Please watch our other programs on YouTube as well as this one. At the conclusion of this program, you will see the information where you can do a search on Google so that you can find our programs on YouTube. And once you find our news programs on YouTube, then you can subscribe to them so that it'll be easy to find every week. And I believe you do get notification as well every time that we upload a new news program. You will be notified so that you can watch the program and keep up to date with what is going on in our local community. So thank you for watching, and we will be back next week. Bye-bye.
Can you explain why you give yourselves such nice raises every year?
Best and brightest.
Is that why our property taxes are going up the way they are?
Mary?
And when did your job become a full-time job? It used to be part-time.
Thank you, Mary. Mary, we do have our appraisers down in the middle of the library if you want to talk to them about your evaluation. Next speaker, name and city, please.
Yeah, good evening. Steve Martinson, North Maplewood, and 20-year resident.
Did you sign up?
I did.
Did I call you? So I've got people that signed up. I want to take them in order, then we'll open it up to people that signed up. Because they did take, I want to make sure we get those.
We couldn't get in the room, Jim.
Pardon me?
We couldn't get in the room to sign up.
I think they're just taking the sign-ups up there and they're sending them up to me.
No, they're not taking any more sign-ups.
Well, we'll get them, but I've got lists.
No, they're not taking any more. John told me.
Before I move to the next list, Arvin Bartz, An Yang, Gary Borja. All right, next list. I'm going to run off a couple of names. And again, I apologize. I know I'm butchering a lot of your names here. And this one is like, I don't know, but 2040 Como Avenue. Twin Lakes Road. That's a lot easier for me. Terry Larson, that's a good one. And Teresa Glass, please come on up. Welcome, and I'm sorry about your name.
I'm Russ Heckendorf from St. Paul. I've lived in St. Paul about 40 years. I played golf at the pond since it's opened. People talk about a golf course. The Ponds is not a golf course. The Ponds is a really great golf course. It's 9 holes, it's high quality, it's in an area that doesn't have a lot of recreational resources. This kind of golf course is the future of golf. And I think it's undervalued by people who are trying to put a value on it. It would be a huge mistake to close this course. You can never duplicate it.
Thank you, Russ. Welcome. Name and city, please.
Hi, Terry Larson, Maplewood resident. And I know to many of the people here, it may seem odd that so many people came out to speak in favor of a golf course. I think if you experience it, and building on the comments of many others, it's so much more than a golf course to so many, especially a lot of the kids that use that facility and whatnot. I mean, if it closes, they won't be able to bike to or walk to another course in their area. And I think a number of people who have raised other issues have made very good points. I'm just going to touch on one of them, affordable housing. I think that the affordable housing crisis is one of the most crucial current issues we are facing in Ramsey County and really everywhere, and it's so important to me. However, I think that it sets up an unfair false choice to pit the Ponds against affordable housing. I believe that there are definitely far more ideal locations at which to address this very crucial problem. Ones that don't require taking away all the beautiful green space and wildlife habitat, not to mention the much-used golf course, but locations where vacant land and or vacant buildings now sit. And I've heard a lot about the changing demographics and the idea that the Ponds doesn't fit within the new 21st century vision for the Parks program. I work every single day in the education policy sector with the goal of promoting diversity and inclusion. So it's important and laudable that these are foundational principles for the future of Ramsey County Parks. However, closing the Ponds would not only not get Ramsey County any closer to that goal, I firmly believe it would actually bring us further away. I know there are private courses or very expensive public courses where it might be true that the users are mostly white, male, affluent, older. However, this couldn't be further from the truth at the Ponds. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you. Ruvelis, Twin Lakes Road, Teresa Glass, Michael Waltz, Shelley Calberry, Matthew Marks, and Tom Miller. Come on up and line up. Any order, it doesn't matter. Come on up. We'll get everybody. Welcome. Name and city, please.
Yes, my name is Michael Wolt. I'm from North St. Paul. I'm here because I'm concerned about misspending money, and it's not just the amount, although my property tax is going to go up 23% this year.
Wow.
And that doesn't include what they talked about, which is like another, they're talking at 0.56% increase this year, 2.5% next year. What's it going to do next year? One of the things I'm concerned about is things like that equity and inclusion levy. And I'm hoping you're not putting a 10% increase in the budget for that. They're talking about a staff position, a couple employees, and $3 million. You have to have programs that basically are smart. And what that means is that they're smart. It means they're specific, they're measurable, they're achievable, they're relevant, and they're time and cost constrained. And if you don't do that, you're not going to have a program that works. Equity and inclusion just sounds like a nebulous concept. It doesn't seem measurable, it doesn't seem a way to be achievable, and it doesn't seem to be cost constrained. It just can keep going and going and going, and nobody's going to put a stop to it because it sounds good and it sounds fair, and that's wrong. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.